Let's see. All right. Hi, guys. Welcome to Agential Topics. I'm Charlie Munford. Agential Topics is sponsored in part by Talking Octopus, which is an organization dedicated to building a physical model of agential biology. So this group is a forum where we try to discover what agential biology really is. So today we have a special guest, Perry Marshall, and he's going to present on his paper that's called Biology Transcends the Limits of Computation. But he has lots more to tell us because he's been involved in a large prize to solve cognition. And so with no further ado, Perry, you can take it away. The format is going to be Perry's going to give a presentation. I'm going to ask a few hard questions, like really hard, just to get things started, and then we'll try to leave at least an hour for open discussion. Hopefully a little bit more than that. So, yeah.
Well,
All right.
good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. There's a lot of really talented people in the room, so um, I'm I'm very honored. So I'm going to get into technical stuff very soon, but before I do, I want to tell you three stories that will explain where I came from, how I got here, and why I'm interested in this. Um,
No, I think Harry.
and so the story starts. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm a pastor's kid. Um, I'm a business consultant in Chicago. I'm an engineer by education, and when uh, when my younger brother Brian uh, got a seminary degree, he was studying to be a pastor, and he ended up as a missionary in China in 2000. And he was teaching English part of the time, and he was doing mission work part of the time. And I went to see him in 2004. So he'd lived in China for 4 years. He'd become fluent in Mandarin. And um, I went to see him, and he said to me, "So I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. And I'm quitting my missionary job, and I'm going home, and I'm not a Christian anymore, and I'm done with this." And I knew he had a lot of questions, but that kind of shocked me. I didn't, whoa, like that's kind of a jolt to the whole family dynamic and all the rest. And so we got into a little argument. And I said, "Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. This is a nice piece of engineering, and I'm an engineer. I should know. You don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you?" And he goes, "Hold on." And he comes right back at me with a very standard neo-Darwinian natural selection mutation answer. Now, I had never actually studied evolutionary biology or anything like that. I just had a very, very powerful intuition as an engineer. You know, this looks pretty purposeful. And so this little argument started, and I remember thinking, you know, I've never learned anything in 5.5 years of engineering school or any of my career. I've never learned anything that would actually support what he just told me. It doesn't make any sense. But I also know that there's a whole bunch of biologists that if they were sitting here listening to us, they would nod their heads and they would agree. And they can't all be stupid. So maybe there's something I don't know. Do the engineers know something the biologists don't, or do the biologists know something the engineers don't? And I thought, I'm not accomplishing anything by arguing with Brian. We could just go round and round in circles. Stop. Just stop. You go home and you figure this out. Stop arguing with your brother. So I just stopped arguing with him, and I stopped ruining our vacation by having an argument. And I said, I am going to figure this out. And for a whole bunch of other reasons, I was very curious. I had lots of existential questions. And now my brother just made this major change in his entire worldview. I got a lot of stuff I got to figure out. And I decided I'm going to let science make this decision for me because since I'm a pastor's kid, I know how squishy theological arguments are. They just go round and round and you change an assumption and you never land on anything. But I'm an electrical engineer. I've designed a lot of things. I wrote an Ethernet book. I designed speakers and the Honda Civic and the Jeep Cherokee and the Acura Vigor and several other automobiles. I know engineering. You can't cheat engineering the way you can cheat in some of these other philosophical things. So I know enough about science. I'm going to let science make this decision for me. And and I went down the rabbit hole. And I was frankly very nervous about where like this could upend my whole life. But you know what? I don't care. Whatever it is, it is. I'd rather just find out what the truth is. Well, so I start buying books and reading scientific papers and going down the rabbit hole and down the rabbit hole and down the rabbit hole. And what I really found out was it's not that the engineers know something the biologists don't, and it's not that the biologists know something that the engineers don't. It's more like the cells and the tissues know something that neither the biologists nor the engineers understand. And yeah, evolution is not a hoax, and it's the most extraordinary engineering you've ever seen anywhere. And it became way more fascinating than I ever thought it was going to be. Like I thought I was just going to try to answer some existential questions and get to the bottom of some scientific problems. Well, now it's 20 years later and I'm still going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the scientific questions. And so that's story number one. Story number two. This is now probably a year or two later after the argument with Brian, and I now have like a whole shelf full of biology books, and I've started getting into like the genetic code and evolution and all the rest of it. And my friend tells me, hey, there's this thing on NPR you should listen to. So I turn on the radio and Richard Dawkins is being interviewed on an NPR station. And a guy calls on the phone and he says, Professor Dawkins, where did life come from? And Richard Dawkins says, it was a happy chemical accident. And the host fawns all over him, like, I don't know, like he's starstruck or something. And everybody applauds. And then they go on to the next question. And I listened to that and I thought, did he actually just say that? You got to be kidding. Like a guy from Oxford University just sat here and told us that life is a happy chemical accident. Like, can you define happy and can you define accident and like what you're going to call this a scientific theory? I was aghast. I could not believe that an educated person would say something like that, let alone Oxford. And I thought to myself, somebody has got to do something about this. Like the inmates are running the asylum. I don't know what's going on here, but like the fact that he can get away with saying this in public, like something is terribly wrong somewhere. So that's story number two. Story number three. When I was 12, my mom went bipolar. She was a fairly normal, healthy person, and she slipped into a mode of bipolar with mild schizophrenia, except nobody knew what was wrong with her. All I knew was mom's crazy. You come home from school, she might be in a good mood, she might be in a bad mood, she might throw a punch, figuratively speaking. we'd spend the whole rest of the evening fighting. I don't know what's going on, but it was really crazy. My dad was a minister at a fairly large church, and he started getting pressure from his bosses. Like, pastors are supposed to have their families under control, and your wife is acting like really strange, and like, you better fix this or there's going to be problems with your job. And so eventually he got her to a psychiatrist, and they correctly diagnosed her bipolar, mild schizophrenia. They put her on medication. The medication immediately started making a difference. And and as soon as his boss found out he'd done that, he got demoted from his job. Um, and then the next Sunday, in front of 2,000 people, they announced that because of some problems with Betty and the family, Bob has resigned from his position. It was just totally humiliating. And and my dad, rather than bailing or moving somewhere or whatever, he stuck to his guns. And he got in his boss's face. And this took 6 or 8 months, by the way. But he said, my wife has a medical condition. This is not sin. This is not, rebellion or anything. This is a physiological problem, and she's on medication, and we're working on it. And you owe me a reinstatement, and you owe her an apology. And he got it. All that got fixed a little later. And my dad died of cancer about 3 years later, and 2,000 people came to his funeral. And he vindicated himself. And I was talking to a friend of mine in London uh, a, a few years ago. She goes, "Hey, Perry, you know that story about your mom and your dad and the church and the psychiatric medication?" And I go, "Yeah." She goes, "You realize that's a war between science and religion story, don't you?" And I'm like, "Not until you just said it just now." And what I realized was that in my childhood, I had been embroiled in our church did not like psychology, and they didn't like psychologists and psychiatrists. But my dad kind of set the record straight with them, and they kind of stopped that. And we went through that whole experience as a family, and then I grew up, and my brother had his crisis, and I was thrust into science. And I discovered that there was another kind of war between science and religion in science. It was just the secular version, where we're not we're not allowed to talk about agency or consciousness or intelligence or anything like that, because everything's just billiard balls banging around in the universe. And so when my friend um, made that comment to me, it suddenly connected a dot. Like, I've really been in this dialogue between two worldviews my whole entire life. And so I think what I'm going to explain to you makes a lot more sense with that background. And we can, when we get into Q&A, we can talk about any of that. But now I feel like I can show you my slides and explain the technical part of what I'm doing, because you have a little more context. So I would like to share my screen. Oh, hello, Richard Watson. Good to see you. Okay, so here's my slide deck. So um, I really do think this is the search for the secret of everything. I don't think that's hyperbole. So we are discussing a paper that I published 4 years ago called Biology Transcends the Limits of Computation. And this paper is really the manifesto behind a $10 million prize that I announced with Dennis Noble at the Royal Society in 2019. When I went down the evolution rabbit hole, I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was I was, well, first of all, when I first started buying biology books and trying to understand this, I was I was gobsmacked by how complicated it all is. I thought this is so far beyond anything I studied in engineering school. It's not even funny. Um, one bacteria is like smarter than a team of Google engineers. And like, how does this even work? And I was really lost for a while. And one day I was studying the genetic code and I go, wait a minute, I've seen this before. I know what this is. This is code. And I had written an Ethernet book in 2002, and I realized the DNA has a data structure just like an Ethernet packet has a data structure, headers and footers, and wait a minute, I can deal with this. And after I had dug around for a few years, I came to the conclusion that the most fundamental science question in science that you can precisely define is the question, where does code come from? And that question sits right at the intersection between materialism and consciousness. And I told you that story of hearing Richard Dawkins on the radio and going, somebody's got to do something about it. Part of the reason I put this prize together was I've heard a lot of really hand-wavy explanations about where the genetic code come from. And when you chase them all down, you always end up with a big bag of smoke. And I said, we have to create a situation where it is absolutely unmistakably clear whether anybody has solved this or not. So I went around to a bunch of clients and I raised money. I put together an investment. I got 10 people to sign in blood that if we meet a specification, which I can describe to you in a few minutes, if somebody figures out how to turn chemicals into code without cheating, we're going to buy that from them for $10 million and we're going to patent it. And if that happens, it's bigger than Google. It's bigger than Amazon. It's bigger than ChatGPT. It's one of the most important discoveries in the world. And the investors of my prize own a piece of it. And so I raised $10 million and Dennis Noble invited me to the Royal Society 6 years ago. And we announced this to the world. And so I did not design this prize as a statement that this cannot be solved. I operate from the assumption that this is a solvable problem, which is not what an intelligent design person would probably do. And my question is, what is underneath this code and what really makes biology tick? And so the bottom level of causation in the world is physicochemical laws, matter, energy, light, heat, fields, waves, weather, stars, planets. And the process of change is order to disorder. The middle level of causation is logic, and this is symbols, communication, computation, languages, machines, algorithms, and genetics. Now, what my prize is the prize is asking, how do you get from physicochemical laws to codes? How do you get there? Nobody knows how. And I think it's a hugely valuable question that will unlock all kinds of mysteries. It's as big as E equals MC squared. And codes are freely chosen local rules. And computation is deductive and deterministic. And codes are subject to information entropy, which is similar to, but not the same as thermodynamic entropy. Then I believe there's a top layer of causation, which I call cognition or choice, and that is agency, action of self-interest, it's meaning and creating codes, and it's also inductive reasoning, which we will return to in a minute. And change over time is from disorder to order, which is negentropy, which is Schrodinger's phrase from What is Life in 1944. And so the conventional view in all the science papers and all the textbooks is that chemicals produce codes which eventually cause cognition to come as some kind of an emergent property. My contention is nobody has ever observed either of those steps on the left ever actually happening. My observation is cognition creates codes which controls chemicals, and we have always observed that that is how cause and effect actually works in the world. So I am asserting that the entire, not all of the scientific profession, most of the scientific profession has gotten cause and effect backwards for 100 years. There are no documented exceptions to date, and the fact that we have a $10 million prize that nobody's come close to winning is evidence for that. And that's why we have it. George Church is on my judging panel. He's a very famous geneticist from Harvard. This has been published in a number of different places. So I wrote this paper called Biology Transcends the Limits of Computation. And in this paper, I say there are 9 things that cannot be computed as algorithms. Computational conventions like having an ASCII code as opposed to a ISO code or something like that. Inductive reasoning, by definition, cannot be computed. I believe that evolution is not computational. Part of it could be, but ultimately it is not. Assigning meaning to symbols, harnessing stochasticity, which was one of Dennis Noble's phrases, axiom in mathematics, representations of scientific laws, all acts of measurement and perception, and negative information entropy. None of these things are computable. They are only possible via agencies. So a very, very basic distinction in philosophy is deduction versus induction. And deduction goes from the general to the specific. All men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And induction says Socrates is mortal, therefore all men are mortal. And that's a statement that you can't prove. So deductive reasoning is computation, and it's anything that a Turing machine can do. You have an input and a computation, and you get an output. Well, when I wrote this paper, I found that I couldn't locate a rigorous definition of induction. So I came up with one. And the rigorous definition of induction is all reasoning that is not deductive. Well, how is that rigorous? It's really Turing's halting problem, which says that if you have a computational process and you are trying to guess how it's going to turn out before you do it, you are doing induction. If you are asking whether a Turing machine will halt, or where it will halt, or when it will halt, or why it will halt, or how it will halt, basically any question about the future that you have not already determined in advance, you are doing induction. So Socrates is mortal, therefore all men are mortal. That is induction. And so organisms reason backwards from a desired output to an input state that they think will produce that output, and that is inductive reasoning. So they sense and measure and predict and model and estimate and infer. And so to me, this is the dividing line between living and non-living things. It's actually induction. and they respond to novel situations in unique ways. So, like, we have Mike Levin on the call, and he had this experiment where they put barium in the water when tadpoles are growing, and their heads exploded. And then the heads grew back barium resistant on the spot. Nobody has any reason to believe that that is a program that already pre-existed. I think the organism inferred the input that would produce the output that would block barium, and it was successful. And even viruses exhibit agency. That's like a whole other conversation. And so, like when I discovered Barbara McClintock and I found out cells actively restructure their own genomes, I thought, why isn't this woman more famous than Charles Darwin? I think, I don't think natural selection is all that interesting. I think what Barbara McClintock found was extremely interesting. And then we have epigenetics and genome chaos. Henry Heng's on this call. He wrote a great book called Genome Chaos, and it's about cancer and cancer cells massively rearranging their genomes. You can get new species in weeks or months. James Shapiro, good friend of mine, I believe he is the first person to come out in the literature and say all living things are cognitive, bacteria have cognition, and agency of the kind I'm describing is exclusive to biology because neither physical laws nor random interactions make choices. And so living things do things like a slime mold can solve the traveling salesman problem for the Tokyo subway, or like just the existence of specific information. Um, it would take more time than the history of the universe to produce 42 specific bytes of information randomly, but living things do this all the time. So, there's Levin xenobots and anthrobots, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. Choice is teleological. Um, so this slide here, this is a diagram of how I think information flows in biology and a relationship between top down and bottom up causation. So on the left side is computation, which is bottom up. The output is just following whatever the program tells it to do. But top down causation has the ability to make choices. And the dotted line running down the middle is the dividing line between past and future. And it's the dividing line between the explicate order and the implicate order. And so there, then in the middle is cognition, codes, and chemistry, where causation really flows both directions. And the left side is the classical world, and the right side is the quantum world. So I would be fairly in line with Stu Kaufman and his models of quantum biology. There's something really interesting about Maxwell's demon, which is in order to have a Maxwell's demon experiment, you have to choose whether the A side or the B side is the side that gets hot. And even Maxwell's demon can't make a choice. Maxwell's demon is an algorithm that keeps cold molecules on one side and hot molecules on another. But the choice of which side is which is a choice, and it's not computable. And so it's what in the Kurt Gödel world would call an undecidable proposition. So any experiment that demonstrates that chemicals produce codes with no cheating would falsify this model. I think the way that we solve origin of life is we figure out consciousness first. Um, and so I arrive at a question. What if neg entropy, origin of life, evolution, strong AI, consciousness, and cancer are really one question, not six? And what if that question, what is the origin and nature of cognition and consciousness? So I think there are implications about this. It says it's impossible to reduce biology to mathematics. And just came out with another paper about that with Stu Kaufman a couple weeks ago. Reductionist methods will continue to fail in all of these fields. They will not solve the problem. I think we are at a third transition in science where we have to recognize that science itself cannot be reduced to fixed laws. And that the soft sciences are richer and more sophisticated than the hard sciences. And physics envy is backwards. The physicists need to start having biology envy. And we are missing something that we might refer to as laws of physics, but they are not like the previous laws that we've known. It also says your goldfish is smarter than ChatGPT. It says AI is all A and no I. And without a fundamentally different new kind of a computer, AI is not going to wake up the way Ray Kurzweil always said it would. And I think our quest to solve this problem is a quest for the next Nikola Tesla or Albert Einstein. I also think that the next breakthrough in AI is, I call this algae on a chip. And this is my little, AI generated rendition of it. But I think getting living things to communicate with electronic things, that's how you get real AI, short of solving this consciousness problem. Um, some last thoughts. You can't understand cancer until you understand evolution. That's a whole conversation in itself. You can't understand evolution until you understand cancer. And we have to cure cancer before we achieve strong AI. Because strong AI out of our control is cancer. So this is an urgently important question. And there we go. Let's discuss.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Perry. You have an incredible gift for clear communication.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It took a long time to to have a short presentation.
I bet. I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. I'm only going to ask a couple of questions because we have such a great group here and I'm just dying to hear what everyone else what it spurs in your imagination. Um the the one question I'll ask just to get us started is something that kind of just on the face of it, your thesis is that the causal direction is cognition codes, and then chemistry.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of inverts the paradigm. So, if that's true, why is it that life has, for the most part, converged on one code? That basically the DNA, the four nucleotides of DNA are fairly universal.
Well, one of the first really interesting things when I long ago went down the rabbit trail was I found a paper called "The Genetic Code is One in a Million," and there's probably a lot of papers that they're about this, but that it's highly, highly, highly optimal for error correction, and that they've simulated all kinds of other kinds of genetic codes, and almost all of them have higher error rates. And so I think a crude analogy would be like, as an engineer, I've been in and out of a lot of automotive plants, and I've seen the assembly of a lot of cars, Toyota, Ford, Chrysler, etc. And I think it's really interesting that almost all cars are assembled the same way. And I would hypothesize that when a when a way of designing a system is like 50% more effective than all the other ways, that it drives all the other ways out of business. Like I think you could explain that with selection if you first acknowledge that the earliest cells were smart enough to optimize it in the first place. And that's the part that everybody skips. So I really think that intelligence precedes life and precedes code. And I think that living things are aware of their relationship to time and space. And I also think that one blade of grass is 10,000 years ahead of any human technology. And so when I mentally roll back to the earliest forms of life, I think of them as quantum computers, if you will, that are projecting forward. So now, like we know, for example, that there are bacteria in the bottom of the ocean that literally get one photon at a time because it's so dark down there, and that quantum tunneling optimizes the path of the photon for energy production to 99.9% efficiency, and that this is essential for photosynthesis. So therefore, photosynthesis is 99.9% efficient. I think you have to bring that kind of thinking to the optimality of the genetic code in order to make any sense of it. I think luck is a terrible explanation for any of this. In fact, I think it's a total abdication of the scientific process to just shrug your shoulders and say, well, I got lucky. I think if you're a scientist, you have a job to formulate systematic, repeatable explanations, not a trip to Vegas.
Nice. Awesome. I think Wayne has a question. Just unmute yourself, Wayne.
Okay. I was wondering, Perry, have you looked at Jesper Hoffmeyer's biosemiotics? Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. That's not Yanni Hoffmeyer who did the extension of Rosen, but that's one of the big guys in biosemiotics. But his book called Biosemiotics, he does a lot of stuff on codes that you probably would find interesting um, in a cellular context. I'm just wondering if you had looked at that book yet.
Um, I I don't know that work. I know Kalevi Cole in Estonia, and I do like I think semiotics is a super important field. Like I think that you can never understand biology without a semiotic view that um, that the genetic code is language, that there are innumerable forms of communication, vibrations, uh, and and ion channels and gap junctions, and uh, I mean, God knows how many different forms of communication are going on inside any tissue, and that it's all language based. And so one way of describing the Evolution 2.0 prize is it's a search for the origin of symbolic relationships. And in language and semiotics, you can build layer upon layer upon layer of a symbol of a symbol of a symbol of a symbol of a symbol, and you can just keep going and going and going. This is why all the AI platforms actually work, is an LLM has like it's a 10,000 dimensional set of vectors that pattern matches. And
Right.
so I don't know, is that
So I kind of want to differentiate between especially Persian biosemiotics, which takes a particular point of view where everything depends on context and interpreting systems. So there's a big difference between formal symbolic languaes, that in a sense are sort of closed and they're sort of face Gödelian limitations, and florid biological contextual semiotics, where what the meaning actually is, any particular sign vehicle could have innumerable potential meanings. It depends on the context, and it depends upon the interpreting system. Mike Levin's work, actually shows this stuff in real experimental context, as opposed to Peirce and all the Persian biosemioticians. I just think you would find that particular book, Biosemiotics by Hoffmeyer, useful for the kind of things you're thinking about.
Yeah, it sounds great. So I think this question of context is also a qualia question. I don't think you can separate the two. So yes,
Well,
there are algorithmic rigid coding systems, but there's a little I have a little video I shot on my website. If you go to evo2.org/autofill, I have this little 6-minute video, and what I do is I take a cell phone and I say, all you can do is select the 3 choices that it gives you for the next word when you're texting somebody. Try as hard as you can to make a coherent sentence without ever being able to type anything. All you can do is select one of the choices. And if you can choose between the 3 choices it gives you, you can keep that going for a very long time and still get a coherent sentence that does not sound like gibberish. And so what that is illustrating is you can have a system that's 99% deterministic and closed, but if you have a little open-endedness where you can make a very small choice, you can steer that system all kinds of crazy places that it would never go by itself because of context.
Nice.
So one more person, Tim Eastman, wrote a book called Untying the Gordian Knot. Also fantastic that I think you would enjoy. And there's actually a series of 9 discussions that's on the Cobb Institute, where they have a whole panel of a lot of people whose work was sort of used in writing the book or quoted. And they have 9 2-hour, I guess you call it a colloquium or something like that. It's just fantastic. I can send you the link.
Yeah. Email me, perry@perrymarshall.info.
Okay. And, you talked earlier about emergence, which, it's a hot topic. And I think you kind of have to differentiate, and this is sort of something Timmy talks about, between synchronic emergence, which is usually what we mean in the complexity field, and diachronic emergence. So synchronic emergence is kind of about levels of reality. And the diachronic is really more about evolution, if you will, evolution of the system. One thing that I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time. One thing I tend to say about emergence is, and this is something that, Robert Rosen and some of his followers really talk about, is a lot of times when we call something emergence, it's really the limitations of the model we're working with. Yeah, it's emergent relative to their model. Like if we think of things in these terms and this is our model, yeah, we would never predict this particular behavior coming out of the system from this model. But it's not because the system couldn't do it to begin with. It's not because it wasn't potential. It wasn't part of the potential, which is really part of reality, which Stu would agree with also. But it's because our model is necessarily incomplete.
Yeah, like I don't think there's any particular mystery about cold, moist air making snowflakes, and that's an emergent property. And like, okay, I get that, but when you say snowflakes are an emergent property of cold, moist air, that's not a hand waving dismissive answer. A lot of times the word emergence is just a fig leaf for I don't have any idea how this happened, but I'm really sure that it must obey these certain laws. And well, you know, let's not have any more questions about that. Next question, please.
Nice. Yeah.
I think maybe Henry was next.
Yeah, Henry, yeah. I couldn't tell if that was part of what your point you were making or if you were calling on someone.
Well, sorry, I wasn't trying to get rid of you, Wayne. I like you just fine.
Serve the same purpose, so it's okay. So I actually, I'm just keep thinking the, Paris model. I mean, at the first time we met, when talking about this order. So there have some progress, in the past few years, we have lots of interaction with Perry, with Jim, with Dallas. I really appreciate this group, the intensively interaction. So what we have, I have, gradually appreciated more is we have to understand the evolution in a historic contingencies way. Because no matter which model, no matter what the theory, there is one phenomena, which is biological system appears after evolution of the evolution become more complexity in terms of both information themselves and the information's carrier themselves, right?
Yeah.
So with those, we really, my second edition of the book, we actually spent tons of time to discuss what's the life and the non-life difference. I appreciate your definition, but on the other hand, I think the capability to information self-creation, that is one of the very important feature for a biological system as such.
Agree. And like, I think one of the most remarkable things ever is the evolution of evolvability.
Sure.
Like that's like exponent to the exponent squared. Like, how does that happen? And I think engineers, so if I can just say this, I think biologists take biology for granted.
Sure.
And an engineer doesn't. Like, my car will just sit in the driveway and rust. But like a car is not anti-fragile, if anybody knows that term from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. But man, a nest of cockroaches sure is. And like they will evolve. Like you put them in an extreme situation, they will find a way. That is just so mind-blowing.
Sure.
And that the fact that sometimes they'll do it in minutes. They will guess a correct solution. Nobody knows it. Nobody in the room knows this better than Henry because of his work in cancer.
So thanks. Well, it's a little bit exactly. But anyway, I haven't get my point yet, because recently we actually try to get the universal model. We try to understand why the Darwin got his model, Lamarck got his model, and Perry got your model. We actually mapping back of each of them in the history of evolution. We found Perry, you are after technology evolution. So you are very, very late of thinking in this whole process. So now we know that when the cell captures the first mitochondria, that law of the genome collaboration, energy production, everything, only at that moment is a miracle. And the biological system adopt this, become biological routine, they just cell dividing. What's the big deal? Right? So the evolution is constantly make the big deal into the biological routine. In such a way, we actually, the evolution is going. So for the engineer, you understand the world is perfect, correct, is after this technology culture evolution. That is the law. So now we put the model initially, chemical code congregation. And now is a congregation code chemical. So the evolution just constantly switch the dynamics, right? So
Yeah.
now we actually, I really found that right now, I mean, Barbara McKinney talk and about 8-5 major theory. We are talking about the same thing, how to create new information, but I totally use different mechanistic to achieve that. Does that make sense to you to think this way?
Yes. And I think, I think the word evolution in normal everyday conversation, like we say the evolution of jazz or the evolution of political ideas or the evolution of poetry or the evolution of driverless vehicles or anything, that word always refers to an intentional process. And the only time it is allegedly an unintentional process is textbook Darwinian evolution. And, well, my discovery was actual Darwinian evolution is every bit as purposeful as any of those other things, if not more so. And each one gives you metaphors for understanding the other. So, does punctuated equilibrium exist in technology? Yes. It also exists when you learn to play the guitar. You're on a plateau for a long time and it just doesn't seem like you're getting any better. And then all of a sudden, one day, well, you sounded a little bit like Eddie Van Halen. Congratulations. For about a minute there, you couldn't do that yesterday, but now you can. And so I really think that all evolution follows a similar set of principles.
Sure. That's actually the, further I just say that bit, I'm just shut up. So in that case, we actually more and more realized that the evolution by and large is not for the innovation, but completely preservation. So that's totally, with that in our mind, now we actually understand more about the learning process, is because initially, even though we know every cell is cognition capable, but that cognition is not enough to not obey the selection. But gradually, maybe 50 years from now on, we can say the cognition become really cognition in terms of the power to break up the constraint of the evolution or environment selection.
So
do you agree with this?
Yes. And when you say preservation, now we have to say preservation of what? The answer is preservation of the self. And now we have a question is what is a self and what is the boundary of a self? So now we are solidly in Henry Hang cancer territory. We're solidly in Michael Levin definition of self territory. And we have to cooperate with other beings to survive. All of us do. And we have these layers and layers of how many think about how many layers of identity you have based on the groups that you belong to. You're a motorist, you're a homeowner, you're a scientist, you're a Lutheran, you're an American, you're a Canadian, you're a denizen of the internet, or like whatever way you want to describe yourself, and they can all be true at the same time.
So anyway, so I appreciate the thinking, but now we try to somehow to integrate of your thinking into the big picture but then just very simple. We just found the increase of the complexity of information. But another surprise is, in fact, when we talk about self, is also it's kind of a fuzzy concept, because seems like all the selection, all the self-organization, all the information, only care life information, even don't care which species they are. That makes us shocking, because we observe the cancer, right? Every time before the massively death, the massively create new information. They're selfish, no selfish at all. They just want to pass the information, share it. And the value is there. And no matter how successful they are, they will be replaced. Anyway, so that's I stop here.
Well, I'm sure glad that we've been working together. It's Henry and I helped start the Cancer and Evolution Working Group, and that was now 5 years ago, and it's been quite the adventure. And there was a reason why Jim and Frank picked you. So I'm really glad you're here, man.
Thank you.
Let's hear from, I think Richard Watson is next. Richard.
Hi. Perry, brilliant. You and I have spoken a lot over the last few years, but I learned a lot from that very brief presentation. It really, things clicked for me, and I understood where you're coming from and the questions you're asking and why you're asking. That was great. I've got a list of things that I just want to say, like a big thumbs up to, which we can go through quickly. Totally agree. Luck is not an explanation for anything. That's just, a placeholder for, I don't understand shit about this. Likewise, emergence, placeholder, I don't understand shit about this. Like, that's a thing that happened. That's all that means. Totally agree. We do not understand how evolution works. We totally understand how the process of natural selection works, but that's not the process of biological evolution, right? That's just a theory that Darwin had that does not explain biological evolution.
It's like if a football coach said playoffs. So what's your defensive strategy this year? Playoffs. What's your recruiting strategy this year? Playoffs. You go, I don't think I'm going to hire this coach.
Totally agree that if you don't understand the evolution of evolvability, you don't understand evolution, right? It's like that you don't understand shit, right? It's like if you're going to presuppose not just that you have variation, selection, and inheritance, but that you have suitable variation, suitable selection, and suitable inheritance in order for adaptation to occur, then you've just presupposed everything you needed in order to make your own theory, right? I also agree with everything that you said about induction, that induction is necessary for adaptation, and that it's necessary for biological evolution, for evolutionary adaptation. It's not necessary for natural selection, because the process of natural selection is deductive. Like, out of all these things which I have, which of them are compatible with the evidence? That's deduction, but that's not what biological evolution is. Also, that biology has to be top down as well as bottom up, that there are those two directions of causality happening. And I think that if we nail what that really means, that's the whole thing, right? If we really nail what top down and bottom up means, that's the whole thing. Also, totally agree that evolution works cognition first, that cognition came before evolution. Evolution is one of the things that cognition does, not cognition is one of the things that evolution does.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna steal that.
And the whole thing starts with induction, and that's what we really mean by cognition. So I think I've been saying the whole thing starts with cognition, and I've been writing a lot about induction, but I haven't said the whole thing starts with induction, and I think that really helps clarify that for me. So in addition to all of those things that I agree with, I also have some thoughts that want to look at things from slightly different angles. So for me, one of the things that bothers me about one of the slides that you presented, several of them, included a sort of three-level architecture from the chemistry or the mechanics to the code to the cognitive level where the choice happens.
Yeah.
And I love things that have levels, but I have a distaste for things that have a finite number of levels. Three is not enough. I want all the levels, right? They can't just be three.
Right.
Right. It's like it has to be, for me, my aesthetic is it has to be recursive. Like whatever the relationship is between level 1, 2, and 3. And now I need to be able to shift up a level, and that's the same relationship between 2, 3, and 4. Right. So that we won't have just a sort of, this is the ground truth, and this is, this particular level which works like that. The relationship between the levels needs to be scale invariant. And then we can go, all the way up and all the way down, and we don't have a particular thing going on.
So I put up a slide here that I didn't show you before. And this is a little more nuanced version. So there are some overlaps there. And so I don't know if this group has discussed Mike Levin's sorting algorithms or not, but they have these bits of emergent behavior that is far from obvious. And when I say emergent, well, I don't mean to be slippery. I just mean they do surprising things. And I think there's overlaps between these. For example, the overlap between chemicals and code would be how many bits of data actually constitutes a message. In the Evolution 2.0 prize, we decided that you have to produce a communication system with at least 5 bits of resolution. Otherwise, what you have is trivial. That's 32 states. The genetic code is 64. But there's a gray area, like, well, what if it was 1 bit or 2 bits or 3 bits? Like, did you really produce a code? That's a gray area. Furthermore, codes, you can have 1,000,000 layers of abstraction in a code. So like this red green thing could be a skyscraper that's 100 stories tall, and you could have, 1,000,000 levels of abstraction or symbology. And then, boy, you get into consciousness, like how many levels of consciousness are there? So I freely admit that I have compressed this down to, 3 little suitcases with handles on them so that people can wrap their head around my thesis and that we can identify some questions. But I totally, like, I'm an analog guy at the end of the day. I made this as digital as I know how to make it. But as an engineer, I'm an analog guy. I'm an audio guy. Well, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not just about how many levels there are, but that the scale invariance for me, so that the relationship between one level and the next is similar all the way up. And my thoughts about how to characterize that are that the top down is to do with multiple realizability. That, we could do this many different ways, but I've made the choice that we're going to do it. So, the bottom layers need to figure out how to do that. That's what you mean by top down. And the bottom up is to do in Dennis's language of harnessing stochasticity. But I would turn it something like the collapsing the stochasticity. It's just the mirror of multiple realizability, that there are, that it didn't really matter how you did this, it has the same effect higher up, right? Tom Froese uses the language eruption and absorption to mean the same thing. And I've been using the language underdetermination, that what happens at one layer matters at the local scale. It determines what happens at the other layer. But at the macro scale, it doesn't, because I don't actually know where I am in the macro layer. But if you told me where I am in the macro layer, then the changes in the lower layer will tell me what changes will happen in the upper layer. But I didn't know where I was, right? It's like there's a one-to-many mapping, right?
So just think how many feedback loops there could be between layer 472 and layer 884, or like I just think we're barely even at the foothills of conceiving how many possibilities there are, and the
Yeah.
fact that it holds it all itself all together.
Yeah.
Can I ask you all a question about your question? Isn't it like, so the way I understood Perry's diagram is as a causal diagram between these three concepts more than a description of actual layers in biology. Like, if I'm understanding it right, it's like codes, chemistry, and cognition are instantiated at every layer all the way, all the way through. So like,
Yeah, for me, what's code? What's code for one layer is chemistry to the layer above, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so the the so all of that sounds like I'm entirely on board with everything you've said, but there's something which I can't figure out what to do with, which is that I think I have a mechanistic model of how induction works that I call natural induction. And it's only a two-layer thing, but it captures the relationship between a space of possibilities at one level of organization and a space of possibilities at another level of organization and the communication between them. And I think that it's definitely not a model of everything that we need. And I can't do it recursively yet. In fact, I've only got two levels, and I was just criticizing you for having three. So there you are. Uh, but uh, I think that it's something to do with induction always looks like deduction after you've stated what the inductive bias was, right? So induction always requires an inductive bias that out of
Yes.
the space of all possible models that would agree with the observations, I'm going to pick some particular ones. And after you've specified what the inductive bias is, which actually comes from the particular instantiation of the algorithm, right? If the algorithm was abstract, then you can't say what the inductive bias is. But when the algorithm is instantiated in particular mechanics, now it specifies the inductive bias. But after you've done that, shit, now it looks like deduction. It doesn't look like induction anymore. And I think that sort of philosophical slipperiness is where our conversations in the past have come a little bit. But I think I did that. I don't think you did do that, but I think I did that. I think that's what's going on there. So that's something for us to dig into
So
going forwards.
I have another slide about
Mm.
that. So I agree, to do induction, you have to have a goal. You have to want something. And a lot of times you can deduce what the next step is going to be once you know what the thing is that you want, but you had to choose what you wanted. So what this slide says is that if a computer is just a Turing machine, which I'll admit that might not be quite correct, but assuming a computer really is a Turing machine, it can only deduce, it can only calculate, it can't do inductive reasoning. Even Claude, ChatGPT, or Google Gemini is only deducing. And the induction, the inductive comes from the user. It's you deciding what question to ask. So Pocket Calculator, smartphone, Google, ChatGPT, they're all deductive machines. None of them are biology. They exist only in the present. They don't have any awareness of themselves with respect to time. They only make statements based on prior states. And even when an AI asks you a question, it's really a statement because the computer doesn't want to know. The user who programmed the computer wanted to know.
Mm-hmm.
Does this overlap with what you're trying to say? Is this a different way of saying the same thing?
Well, the way that it doesn't feel like it's everything, but a thing that does resonate with me about that is that there's a zooming in or zooming out of the frame of reference.
Yeah.
So like within a particular frame of reference, it's like, oh fuck, it's all deduction. And it's like, where did the induction come from? It came from something outside of that system, and it always has that flavor. But if I zoom out so that I can see the system and the person that asked the question, now that's all deductive, right? That there isn't something, I don't think that there's something, I was going to say something I might have regretted. I'll say it anyway. I don't think that there's something special about it's because the stuff on the outside is biological or because the stuff on the outside is living. I think that that's a perspective about whether you zoomed in or whether you zoomed out when you looked at it. It's more like that.
Well, so I have a way of expressing Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and it goes like this. Anything that you can draw a circle around requires something outside the circle that you have to assume but can't prove.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a logical system and you want to prove, and you have a part of it that you can't prove, like mathematicians know this,
Yeah.
you can make a bigger system that is based on more primitive notions, and now you can prove what originally was unprovable, but now you have gone outside the system, and you have another thing that you now have to assume that you can't prove, and you never get away from that.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I think that biology can be both consistent and complete by having agency. It can always make a decision that makes the present make sense. But it also means it's always in disequilibrium. So I wrote a paper just a few weeks ago with Stu Kaufman and Cy Gart, and we said there are no equal signs in biology. Biology is always in disequilibrium.
Fantastic. Really good, Perry. Thank you so much. I'm going to dig into that more with you in future.
Awesome. This is a great conversation so far. I'm really enjoying this. I think Robert might be next.
Hi, Perry.
Hi. Where are you from?
I'm from the Netherlands.
Welcome.
I might be in the dark by now. So excellent conversation, discussion, and I'm totally on board. Where I'm coming from is music, electronics, and just life experience. But the question I had was that top-down, bottom-up picture you showed. Isn't that just self-regulation?
Let's take a look.
That's just the whole.
This?
The one, yeah.
Well,
according to me, that's you just displayed a picture of self-regulation.
Yes. Yes. And your awareness of your relationship with time, like a machine only exists on this line, and it may have memory. So maybe there's stuff that trails behind it, but only a conscious agent has an awareness of the future and their, I know, I was a teenager in the 80s, like where you are in the playhead, when where the tape is relative to the playhead of right now.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I think all biology has an awareness of time and the future. And so that means one of the most fundamental mistakes in the history of biology is just assuming that everything is Newtonian and it's just a calculated product of the previous state. Well, that might be true of rocks, but it's not true of anything that's alive. So what this really means is that we are barely at the foothills of biology even becoming a proper science. Like biology is just right at the threshold of really becoming a full-fledged field that's being honest with itself. We've barely got started. It's also why most medicines don't cure anything.
So my contention is that self-regulation leads to self-discovery. But we're dealing with infinity. So we're trying to contain infinity. And once we've found the state where we've contained this infinity, that's what we call self-actualization.
Mm.
And then you've actually discovered the next layer of organization. So while we are dealing with this self-regulation, we're actually figuring out how the next layer of organization fits in with what's already there. So the quantum world is where this new layer gets figured out until it fits. It's like trying on a new piece of garment that you're stitching on the fly.
Yeah. I
But
agree.
this stitching on the fly, this is self-regulation. And everybody has their own sort of unfinished puzzle, their own unfinished work. So at the end of the story, the self-actualization is the same for everybody. Because that's when you've discovered the next layer of organization.
So, you know,
And then, so I think this picture is just brilliant because this explains the self-regulation.
you know what you just described is the existential struggle to understand our place in the universe.
It's all self-discovery
Yeah,
from beginning to the end.
that's right.
And we're just ants in the anthill. And we think we're busy surviving, but in the meantime, there's this self-discovery going on.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. Like you go from A to B to C, and you think you're trying to regain a balance when you're off balance, but actually you're moving around. You're never the same.
Yeah.
So,
No man steps in the
yeah,
same stream twice because the stream
yeah,
isn't the same and neither is the man.
yeah. And then eventually it dawns on you, you get a bigger picture because now you've traveled all over the place, and now you're sort of starting to stitch all the ends, all the loose ties together. And that's pattern recognition. And that's where I think the real consciousness is happening. Like we start out sort of in ignorance, but the longer we travel, and actually it's the story of Homer, the Odyssey. It describes the whole process, including the self-actualization, which is when he arrives back in Ithaca.
I think
These are the punctuated epochs, Eldritch and Gold.
Mhm.
So this is one layer, and we between brackets. Federico Fagin calls them saties. Like yourself dissolves at the end of it. Like there's no use for self anymore because the garment fits. So there's no tension, no struggle anymore. So you won't even be able to feel or do anything because it's all perfect. So if a Kantian whole would apply, that would be it. Because now you're whole for a short period of time. Or time doesn't exist at that point.
I think the more literature you've read and the more poetry and the more of any of that you're familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
the more frames you have to try to describe this larger picture.
Yeah, totally.
And one time I asked Jim Shapiro, I said, getting an English degree at Harvard and then going to Cambridge for a master's in genetics, that's kind of a weird career path. I said, does that have anything to do with your unconventional take on everything? And he says, yes. The biologists were never allowed to tell me what I wasn't allowed to think. I think he formed his intellectual foundation in literature,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of grew up, and then he went into the allegedly quote unquote exact science of molecular biology after he'd grown up. And,
Yeah,
and
it sort of needs, I guess, left brain, right brain integration.
yeah,
Yeah. Like either way, you won't get there. You'll miss out.
yeah, that's exactly right. And Wayne just mentioned Ian McGilchrist. Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to mention him. Yeah.
I think Mary has her hand up. Robert, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Oops, you're muted, I think.
I love the way that you think, Perry. I've always said engineers make the best biologists. I think Henry Ford would be proud.
That's why Joanna Xavier is here too. How many engineers are in the room, by the way? I'm just curious. Any?
I'm a child of a whole generation of engineers and my brothers, so. But my point is actually something tying together what Richard has said and what Robert just said, and a conversation I've had with a number of different people in this room about the difference and what you said about semiotics, Perry. I think that one of the frames, that, as you just mentioned, that is very important to look at here is perhaps we're not being anthropomorphic enough. Perhaps we should be looking at all the holonic levels of life as levels of organizational cultures. And when I took that inductive point of view and I started looking at trees, for example, and forests, I discovered that there's a great deal of literature evolving right now, demonstrating, emerging, that trees have highly complex cultural relationships and they teach their young and they teach each other. I've had a cat that wasn't raised by her mom to slit open the belly of a mouse and eat the entrails, so she can't really eat a mouse. She didn't get that culture. If you look all the way down, and when you get down to the cellular level, there are many things that cells and parts of cells can't do unless they have come from an appropriate culture. And this would also explain a lot of Levin's work, where you take cells out of a culture and they have to do something else, and so they innovate. They can't just act like the esophageal cells anymore. They're not trained to do that, but they can be trained by the cells in the tail of a tadpole to make an eye. So I think that if we could think of ourselves as microzoologists and as the animals of having a culture, the little cells, the animalcules, as having a culture and teaching one another, and using semiotics and their whole world being made up of semiotics, a lot of our problems would fall away. And I see things that everyone in this room has said fitting into this. And Marco and other people here know about my infamous giant lit reviews. I'm putting together a giant Google Doc demonstrating this across the holons. I'd love to have this conversation with other folks.
So, Mary, let's take what I 100% agree with what you just said. And now let's flip it around. Imagine what if, so think of your body as a corporation with 10 billion or trillion employees, or however many cells that is.
39 trillion to 100 trillion, depending on how you count your microbiomes,
Okay,
your
so
microbiomes.
Mary Lynn Corporation has 39 trillion employees.
That's correct.
Imagine
they're co-owners, because in mine I'm using the
Yes.
Mondragon model.
Yes, it's employees, it's employee shareholders, and
That's right.
imagine
An entrepreneur.
a company that is as well behaved as the cells of your own body, and everybody got up and went to work and did what they were. Imagine if you had a company that was as well orchestrated as any healthy biological organism.
I imagine this all the time, Perry. That's why I try to teach people group work. Yeah.
Could you imagine how good?
I do this all the time, and we're terrible at group work, as many people have mentioned here, and including Robert. Once we get to the level where we understand, have a certain apperception of ourselves as an individual, as an entity, we can only learn more about that self by having the next holonic layer of consciousness. And this is integral theory. There's the spiral dynamics. There's lots of different bodies of work thinking about this. We can only understand more about the individual self by abandoning the self and going to the next level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every eulogy I ever heard at any funeral was about how
Yes.
non-Darwinian the person was.
And how they cared about others more than themselves, which is rarely actually true for more than a few moments at a time, because we're not good at this yet. Yeah. And Henry Hang's work is perfectly in here. Henry demonstrates what are true, following in the footsteps of our venerated one of our venerated saints of this conversation, Barbara McClintock. A revolution happens when the culture is so dysfunctional that you have to abandon it and reorganize at the very basic level of the most primary library of code.
Yeah. Let's try to avoid that, please.
Let's try to avoid that. And we can avoid that if we can surrender ourselves to developing a higher sense of ourselves and the ability to work together and to understand the stages of group work and of ego death. And there's plenty of technology out there. You can choose Buddhism, Christianity, Tucker's model, Scott Peck, you name it.
Preach it, sister.
Hey, I started as a Christian. We didn't, a Catholic, we didn't fall from very far from the same tree.
Totally.
You know, St. Paul said something like, shall the eye say to the foot, I have no need of
Exactly.
you because I can see. No, doesn't work that way.
That's right. So then, so I do have one question to the stunned audience. We can't believe that I turned this all into a little pulpit, you know, pumping, you know, from a Christian perspective originally, although I'm now shamanic, basically. Who out there is actually looking at redefining cell culture to be something other than an agar medium? Who's doing that? Who's looking at the culture of cells? I want to write a paper about this with everyone in the room.
Okay, so I have a couple
I'm
stories about
serious.
I have a couple
Okay.
stories about that. So the first time I met Kimberly Bussey at ASU,
Mm-hmm.
I hope I'm not speaking out of school. She said, I do cancer research and cancer cells like to be talked to. And when we did the Cancer and Evolution Symposium with Henry, we had some Zoom calls afterwards, and every speaker had a little Q&A session. And I got into a conversation with Eric Kulker, who's a psychologist. And what we started discussing was, how do you get a cancer cell out of fight or flight?
Okay, this is exactly it. You do that by creating the cellular equivalent of a oxytocin tend and defend mode.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that we have opiates down to the very some of the most and opiate receptors and some of the simplest. I believe then that they're in archaebacteria. How far down do oxytocin and oxytocin-like chemical responses and networks occur? See, I think that this is the basis of lots of things that we call quorum sensing. Let's just think about it anthropomorphically. We'll learn a lot.
Yeah.
Well,
I-
can I ask Henry, Henry, because I'm actually curious about what the limits of the tissue field theory of cancer are, because like from this way of thinking that you've mentioned, like that Mary's talking about, I mean, and Mike Levin's experiments in this have demonstrated, like if you can reconnect the gap junctions from within the tumor to outside the tumor, you can at least partially dissolve the tumor. But I'm assuming that hasn't fixed everything, right? I mean,
No,
it's not a complete
yes,
theory.
that is a very good question. So now the idea actually we just as biologists currently we put too much emphasis to the specific mechanism like the cell communication, gene modification, environmental stress. But in fact, if you think about this question, the cancer is just a new system, information system emerge. After thinking this, okay, you understand everything because they have the combination of more pathways than the universally particle, right? So therefore, the evolution themselves actually most of them is constrained because without the constraint, they have all the different choices. But with this constraint, you only have limited choice. So when the Michael brilliantly just to change the dynamics and take away the constraint of the tissue, right? The development constraint, of course, they have all the different way to do everything they want. But the problem is, while they can do everything they want, the crazy behavior, they cannot be meaningful in terms of inheritance to pass on to a new system. That is the key. So after you lock out this key, you will see so many new novel biology, but that is evolutionary meaningless in the way of the system need to continually pass the information, right? So that actually is this many things. Now we actually very much question the current molecular genetics to study the cancer because we artificially created the situation which is among all the unlimited choices, but we just highlighted them, give us the pattern we feel comfortable. But this pattern have nothing to do with clinical reality, right? So that's a problem. So back to the Mary's question, we have cultured the cell for decades, right? So it's it's not just simply some behavior of the cell change. Is in fact those culture stuff that always become a mixture of the super system, which means they have all the different stages of the cell, all the different species, all lumped together, right? So for the tissue field, the same thing. I will ask Charlie ask the tissue field. I mean the Carlos, we debate with Carlos to think, what's the difference? And he said, can you tell me what's the difference between cancer and a normal cell? Because people thinking they're all the same, but just have some epigenetic regulation is different. They're totally wrong, because the cancer cell and the normal cell have completely different genome, right? So that is a problem. It's not simply collaboration in everything, because for example, the human behavior and the cell behavior is very much, they have similar part, but fundamentally different part, because for the cell as an organism, so they have different coding. When this coding incorporate with the whole body, the lower level intelligence be surprised, because they no longer as a function as an individual, even though they have the individual capability, even though you isolate individual cells, they become more smart, but when they're together, they're more dumb as such, right? Because the evolutionary selection is always selecting the package without consider the individual cell. That's why the selfish gene completely falls from there. But from history of evolution, perhaps when this some of the early cells they only have dozens of genes, yes, selfish gene was correct. Because at that time, each of gene will totally determine the direction of evolution. But as soon as the chromosomal get into the center, individual gene just lost that privilege. The prioritization is just totally changed. Until in the future, maybe another 50 or 100 years, when the AI take over the human, the genome become insignificant as well.
So now we need we need a binge watching TV series about when the chromosomes took over the genes, and the genes had to get revenge and they had to fight back, and they would live another day.
Yeah, exactly, from away. But now we actually very worried about, because now we actually, from evolutionary point of view, we think the evolution is all the system replacement. So now if we have very intelligent system and the evolution is on between any system with a human, we are going to lose. So we need the wake up the humanity to have such a debate in the future, because should we think about this issue or not? Because initially from Darwinian thinking, people thinking, oh, the life just survive productive, very slowly going on. But now we know no matter how successful you are, you will be replaced. That's a history, if you're talking about history. So now we are at the time to be replaced. Or just keep just have a little bit, because my research, he wanted to write the cell, how the behavior, everything. So we have lots of story if in the future, if you want to listen to the cells behavior emerging everything, because actually the cancer told us about the information. One of the phenomena we do not understand is if you slowly kill the cancer cell, and the behavior very well. But if you drastically all of a sudden want to kill all of them, the trigger the system chaos, and then all the chromosomes just create new information, right? So the billions of cells, none of them is the same.
Not all of us are super enthusiastic about apoptosis.
No,
it's a hard pill to swallow.
In fact, for a long time we thinking that if a cell is apoptosis, the finished story. No, that death is the beginning of the newborn. Completely, new biology is emerge. That's we had the problem. Yeah.
Is there like a symmetry? I'm sorry, I'll call him Richard in a sec, because I'm sure he's got something really interesting to say. But am I understanding it correctly if you're saying like the tissue, the tumor has evolved, okay, it's changed its bottom layer, which is its genome, And so by definition, it's changed the language with which it communicates with the world. And so reconnecting it is like trying to persuade someone of an explanation that they've gotten over, right? And so so by definition, like the tissue field theory works a little bit because you can reconnect the synapses, and on that domain, it can still communicate with the outside world. So it dissolves a little bit, but it isn't a fundamental solution to cancer, because cancer has changed the language with which it's changed its interface. And since the interface has more than one domain, reconnecting some of the interface doesn't, like, it's not a fundamental solution.
No, we don't think so, because majority of the cancer at the aggressiveness, they are no longer follow any biological law. For example, they are not one cell divided two cell to become four cell. They just one explosion, one big cell become hundreds of the cell. So the biological law, we have learned everything. I mean, it's not there no longer, right? So we have to think about all of this. So basically, the cancer that have the two big cluster. One cluster is the development of differentiation got stopped each stage. So in that way, those type of cancer, is minor proportion of cancer, it is epigenetic problem. It is a field problem. If you change the field, so the cell continue differentiation, you solve the problem. But the vast majority of the cancer is after differentiation. They already become certain tissues under stress, under virus infection, all this stuff. And then they reprogram, they change the genome. They become totally different system. That is this cancer. So that's why, for example, when you fusion with the cell with the embryonic environment, they always can suppress the cancer. But when the cancer becomes vigorously, nothing can suppress it, right? So it's very different. It's very different.
So this is like the reason why symbiogenesis is really uncommon. Like we were just talking about, Josh and Dina and I were talking about this morning. It's like in nature, like it doesn't really make that much sense that organisms don't fuse together more often than they do. It's like really
actually this is common, but it's not become dominant, is very less common. So for example, in the cancer cell, normal cell, the immune cell, constant fusion, but they can act. But that's why the evolution is so important, because if you don't have powerful mechanism to constrain, you're not going to see the system, right? The working in the one generation, they're just gone. So that's why the evolutionary selection, especially all this evolution themselves, developmental process, function of sex, environment, all of this is try to keep the system not go back to the simple chemical. So that's why the evolution themselves is become more and more complex. It's because there's no way come back. The inheritance, everything is stuck there. Do not let the system back to the simple life form. So that is beauty of the evolution, is just for the preservation per se. If you think in that way, it becomes fascinatingly, interesting. So for example, I think we're supported Perry's idea very much is in the future, the evolution is completely consciousness directed evolution with the predictable results. So far, the biological system, even though they are gradually become smarter and smarter, but they cannot deliver the prediction results. Human cannot. We put the water system, we put a dam there, and then the earthquake is coming. Oh, it's bad. We put all the toxin to kill the cancer is coming back. Oh, it's bad. So we even cannot predict it, right? But in the future, I think it's completely new dynamics of evolution is combination completely first. Code, artificial coding with the human's help is going to completely change the world. Yeah.
Richard?
Oops, muted.
Sorry, thank you. Fascinating stuff. It's tricky for me to ask a question because whilst I'm waiting to ask a question, another half a dozen questions come. I wanted to return to something that Robert said, Thanks for your communications, Robert. It's nice to meet you in person, although you've receded into complete pitch black now, so we can't see you at all. But well, look, he's about self-discovery, because I've been thinking about what is the prime mover if it isn't self-preservation, right? If natural selection isn't the prime mover, and let's just assume that we're all smart enough to know that it isn't, what is the prime mover, right? And it's really easy to slip and say things like cooperation is necessary for survival, or even that love is necessary for survival, right? Because when you say that, you're saying, survival is still the prime mover. I was only cooperating because it enabled me to survive. And it's like, no, that's still putting selectionist thinking as the basis, right? That's wrong. The way that it has to go is there has to be a different prime mover. So I've been describing it as more like love, that the prime mover is more like deeply vulnerable mutual knowing. My ears prick up at Henry talking about wanting to communicate information, and that being a separate motive from wanting to survive or wanting to reproduce or Darwinian fitness. No, I just want to communicate. I just want to have a conversation. And the self-discovery that Robert mentioned feels like a really nice complement to self-preservation. But the thing that raises a red flag for me is that it still has the word self in it, as though there was a self that was doing some discovery. But a more generous way to think about it, which I imagine is the way that Robert meant it rather than the way that I first thought about it, is that self-discovery is the kind of self-discovery where a new self emerges that wasn't there before. It's a self-emergence, it's a self-creation, it's the origination of a self, not, I'm already a self and I'm wondering what kind of a self I am, right? And that, so then I was trying to think, how does that interpretation of self-discovery or self-origination, how does that relate to love, symbiogenesis, communication, mutual knowing, right? And it's like, well, it kind of obviously does, because the way that you create new stuff is by creating new relationships between stuff that weren't there before, right? So you used to have a jumble of independent things, and now by creating new relationships at a higher level of organization, you have a higher level thing that wasn't there before, and a self is originated. But there's also, so that in that way I was able to make a connection between Robert's self discovery and the deeply vulnerable mutual knowing as a prime mover, how I was thinking about things. But there's also an inside-outside thing, right? That self discovery is also about understanding what the parts are that are coming together, but also understanding how you are a part of something larger that's already there. A sort of looking inwards, looking outwards sort of notion of self-discovery, self-discovery is about recognizing how I am a mirror of what's outside me, or I'm becoming a mirror of what's outside me, a self that is created by the context. Those were just thoughts that were floating around. It's not a question.
So, Richard, what if you take any one of those things, like cooperation is necessary for survival, and you flip them around and you say, no, survival is necessary for cooperation?
Yeah, that's right.
Like a 58-year-old woman gets diagnosed with cancer, and what does she say? She says, well, I'm going to get some treatments because my grandchildren need me.
Yeah.
And she's not saying because I need my grandchildren. No, she's saying they need me. She wants to make sure they get taken care of. Like,
yeah, that's right.
And I think you could make a long list of these things. And really, Dennis's thing about no privilege level of causation also applies because life is in a whole entire experience. It's never one thing.
Yeah. So I make the connection that, you know, I was my starting point is love is the prime mover, but love requires intelligence in the sense of care as a driver of intelligence in Mike's writing, and others. But intelligence requires learning, and learning requires memory, and memory implies that something is being preserved. That's the only reason that you need self-preservation, is because you need to remember something in order to learn something, in order to be smart about something so that you can love, right?
Yeah.
That, you know, that's the way around that the cause is.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, you know, Richard, the circle of this one, and if we thinking this under the information, I mean, of course, the love, feeling, learning, this is all of this are higher level of information form, right? So in that case, we are easier because we right now use you know, all the different stage of evolution, one by one, just not just the three of them, and the clearly during the historical evolution on the Earth, the consciousness, you know, the degree of consciousness is very different. So I actually discussed with Jim. Jim said that, you know, I don't know how, you know, the sophisticated the bacterial intelligence they are because we do not know how to measure them, right? But my response is that even though we cannot measure them, but at least we know they cannot design the spaceship, right? So from that perspective, we know the consciousness, the degree is different, even though we don't know how to measure.
I think that's just different degrees of distance from us. I mean, to them, the fucking spaceships that molecules have built that we call cells, I mean, they are so much cooler than our spaceships.
Yes, that is the results of the product's complexity. But in terms of when they design this principle, for example, for the bacteria, right? Initially they respond, lots of them make a choice, but most of the time, even the organism is involved in this process, but they cannot make the difference in the way of the change. But at the later stage, the human involved, the selection and the environment and human selection, they become mutually selected evolution force. So that is very, very different when we're talking about mutual selection rather than the selection, right? So initially, I think the mutual selection capability is rather low. Most of it dominated by the environment. So, for example, the animal is much better now because the environment is worse. I just escape, right? Animal just, you know, run into another places. So that's another example of the mutual selection become more and more predominant as such, right? So that's the thing. So we need to thinking this quantitatively in such a way because we know the consciousness, no matter what, is a more complicated information form. So that's why we put the information as a information management as a 4 category. The first category people ignored is information self-creation, right? So information self-creation capability, of course, during evolution, seems like it's getting more and more powerful as such, right? So that's exactly, so that's this question actually related to the cancer as well. So second one is self-preservation. So biological system self-preservation, the peak, the evolved inheritance, that is very powerful because, you know, for Perry talking about from the disorder to order, you need the organization scale, you need the preservation, every achievement after it's working, you do not want to go back by the equilibrium, you come back, right? So therefore evolution just put more and more coding. So if you say, so bacterial coding is much less than the neural cell coding because every time you put more coding, so they just get more, you know, defined regulation, everything as such. So in that case, I can clearly say, Richard, you know, the love, you know, the cooperation circle become more dominant at the certain stage of evolution, and it will be more dominant in the future if we want to build a very harmonious society as such, you know, as this. So this two category people kind of ignore. But the third one is the modification, the gene mutation, epigenetic, all this collaboration way. That is people study, and the last one is how to use them, you know, all the information. But the problem for biology, unique problem or beauty of biology is when they become next stage, they have higher, they incorporate the previously become inseparable parts. If you take away, it doesn't make sense, but together, that is wonderful. But then the lower level have to give up the intelligence in such a way. Just like an individual or faculty, right? Our faculties, you know, the interest is different from chairman, a different president of the university. It's totally different. You know, you're thinking, I'm doing the personal, they don't care what you're doing. You just bring the money to the university. So that's the goal, right? This totally conflict with the individual's goal.
Yeah.
So that's the system behavior. Every time when they move to a lower level, the relation is completely changing. So every time it's changing. So we need to go back to evolution every time to say what's the law, what's the mechanism, and what's happening. So in that way, we understand evolution is much more easier to understand. Yeah.
Nice. Guys, thank you so much. I'm going to have to, with great reluctance, start to wrap up. And I wanted to give a minute or two for Perry, you know, but I just, before I say, I just want to say thanks to Perry for stimulating this amazing discussion, and it's all recorded. So, yeah.
I just appreciate the incredible, intense interaction and discussion today. It was super fun. Thank you.
Right on. All right, guys. Well, let's do it all again next month. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Perry.
Good work,
Thanks,
Charlie.
Perry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.